hair if you're going to do that.
Folks, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. We're joined today, Storybook Mountain Vineyard owner, Jerry Seps. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you.
Going back to your earliest memory, I just would like you to talk to the audience about how you grew up and the culture, how wine was involved in the culture, how you grew up.
Well, wine was involved in the sense that my grandfather had a wine and spirits store. My father worked for a wholesaler in Southern California. And early on, I was a sommelier at the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite.
Is that a tour guide?
As a sommelier.
So what did wholesale look like with what your father was doing?
Looked like a very tough task.
Could you explain what it was like at that time? I mean, he was selling wholesale wine?
Yes, wholesale wine and liquor.
And what year was it?
Oh, this would have been in the late 40s, 50s.
So were you involved at all with him?
No. I'm old, but not that old, thank you.
So you're at Yosemite. What was your hook into winemaking?
I was invited to be a sommelier. I was working at the hotel, and sommelier before me quit, and they were looking for somebody. And
just for the layperson that's watching around, could you explain what sommelier?
Sommelier is a person that serves wine to their guest, suggests the appropriate matches on the menu, tries to find the ideal combination that the guest will enjoy.
And this was at a restaurant in Yosemite, would you say? Or was it a lodge of sorts? What was it like?
You're not very familiar with California, are you?
Oh. I'm a New Yorker.
Oh, I kind of thought that. The Ahwahnee Hotel is the largest hotel in Yosemite National Park. Very famous dining room, very beautiful room, about 3 stories high, and very well regarded.
So that was your introduction to tasting wine and pairing it with food?
I would say it's more intensive one, aside from, experiments we all make while we're young.
So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the idea of Storybook? I mean, what that name in itself has an allure to it that is fascinating. And could you talk about a turning point when you decided to go for this incredible establishment?
Well, we decided to purchase this property back in 1976. By we, I mean my wife and I. And it used to be owned by 2 brothers named Grimm, Jacob and Adam Grimm.
The Brothers Grimm.
The
Brothers Grimm. I love it.
And it was actually called the Grimm Vineyards and Wine Vaults. And that was not a title or name that we wished to revive. So in honor of those brothers, it became Storybook. But also we felt the location was very much a Storybook location, set at the top of the valley with redwood trees right outside the window and caves dug by the Chinese back in the 1880s. It had a very strong Storybook feeling, and I think maybe a third reason was Storybook, when you tell people stories, it's to enhance their life, and I think that's what wine should do as well. Should enhance your evening, your life a little bit.
Explain how you define enhance. I mean that's one of the issues we have is that I don't know if you were growing up if your parents gave you a splash of wine with water or how you got introduced to it. But I work one of my advertisers on my radio program is a cardiologist, Dr. Ted Goldfinger, and he focuses a lot of his attention on heart health and moderate red wine consumption. Were you exposed to, how early at an age were you exposed to wine?
I don't know, probably quite young. I have to admit, I don't remember.
But it was like 5, or you were 5 or 6 years old, maybe?
Who knows when it was. It
right.
was usually, feast days, big days that were important for the family, and you'd get a little bit of wine.
So that's what I'm curious about is, did your father, or did you grow your own vegetables and your own wine?
No, we were urban dwellers.
You were?
Yes, indeed.
So how long did it take you to find Storybook?
It took quite a while. I was a professor of European history in the university, and then My wife and I looked for 2 years before we found this particular property.
European history. That's that. Did you know the land? What the land was like? How quickly did you know it was going to be a fertile?
Well, we had looked, as I said, for 2 years, and we could kind of evaluate the promise of the site. We also knew a little bit about the history of the site, and we had talked to a number of people in the valley, and we had a feeling that this would be a good site. But you don't know until you plant it, of course. But we did know that it was planted starting in 1883, and that the Grimms were award-winning winemakers. And I think even at the Paris Exposition back in 1890-something, they had won a prize. So there was potential here.
So you knew the history going in.
A little bit of it.
And could you talk a little bit about the most daunting part of getting, I mean, it is a fully established Mecca. I mean, it's a sanctuary here, but it was not that way when you bought it. So could you talk about some adversity you faced early on and how you overcame it and how you made you a stronger leader?
Well, there was a big fire that burned through this area. There was one, as you know, currently in October, but there was a fire back in '64. It burned exactly the same area and over this property. It burned down the winery, burned down the house that was here, and basically destroyed the vineyard. So when we got here, it was just a burned over piece of land. So we had to start from the ground, literally from the ground up. It was, if you want, a tabula rasa. It was a blank slate on which we could cast our fate. So I think the main problem was not a lack of willingness to give it a try, but the amount of money that it takes to give it a try. That was always a major problem. And while I was a professor, I was a tenured professor, that salary is not quite enough to put a lot in the bank, shall we say.
A professor salary?
Yeah, that's right.
That's you just went over me a little bit there. What was the most investment you had to put in? Was it to rehabilitate the ground? What does a fire do to the ground?
Well, the fire destroys all the old framework that was around here, you know, all the trellising, everything else that might have to do with growing of grapes. So we had to start literally everything, putting in pipes, putting in fence to keep out the deer, putting in the vines, of course, and rehabilitating the winery. So it was a complete reconstruction, should we say.
How many years did it take after you rehabilitated it for you to start growing substantial? And what kind of was it? Was it a Zin? Was it a Zin farm?
Zin was one of 5 varieties that were on the property before we came.
What were the 5 varieties?
5 varieties were Zin, it was Cabernet, Burger, Chasselet, and I've now forgotten the 5th.
It's all right, it'll come back.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Yeah.
So talk about
Riesling was the 5th one.
the rehabilitation of the land. How long did it take for you to be able to grow?
Well, we bought the place in '76. We had our first commercial harvest in '80. We had the first release of our wine in '83. We didn't make a profit until the end of the '80s. So 13, 14 years, basically.
If you were, how many people come to try to, has anyone approached you to buy this land?
Sure. Yes, a number of times.
A number of times. And why won't you give it up?
We didn't come here to make a profit. We came here to live a good life and to make wine and be creative. And money is fine, money is necessary to keep things going, but money's like fertilizer. It should be spread where things can grow.
How have you been able to be creative in this business? Give an example.
Give an example. Planting Zinfandel. It's been recognized as 14 times as one of the top 100 wineries in the world. Zins that are included in the top 100 wines of the year after year. I think that's pretty creative.
And how have you been able to spread the money to let things grow? I mean, what have you done? I mean, being a humanist and somebody who's a studier of sociology and history, how have you been able to spread that to enlighten and inspire other people?
Well, what you do is you create a wine that can be appreciated. You take that wine out to restaurants and other locations that people are in a mood to enjoy, and you convince the buyers to take that wine on and see how it does. And our wine works particularly effectively in the restaurant scene. We have been told by Wine and Spirits magazine a couple of years ago we were the favorite of sommeliers all over the U.S. So that's how you spread the word. You provide the wine in the right atmosphere. You provide a consistent beverage that has high quality. You attract people to the wine, and then they spread the word for you. And that's really necessary if you're not out with lots of advertising dollars.
How important was it to have that that gig at Yosemite for you to? What did you learn about the pairing of? Could you give an example of a pairing, a genius quality that you had that you maybe didn't reveal at the time, but you were like, this goes well with this. So, I mean, Bob Bialy was talking about growing up. I'm not sure what he was having in Zinfandel, but it was a pairing of rabbit stew. And I'm not sure exactly what
He
kind
would have had it with Zinfandel, I bet.
Yeah. Oh, so that was that. What were the little nuanced things that you realized that you had a taste? Your palate could taste?
Well, it's based on the nature of the wine, the acid balance in the wine, the flavors of the wine. It can be anything. Zinfandel, for instance, will go with a salmon that's been on the grill. It's great with deer. We have a roast lamb barbecue here every year for our club members, and that's obviously a perfect accompaniment. So there is a wide variety of food with which it will go quite well.
Who's come up here? Did Francis Ford Coppola come up here at all, or did any movie actors, or not actors, directors, or people of in the entertainment world, have they frequented Storybook?
I don't know. We're not in that kind of social.
But you have really good wine. People want to see the name. The name itself is it is a Storybook. But if so, the beginning was 76. That's when you felt
we bought the property, right?
Right, and the fire was in 74.
Was in 64.
And driving up here, I've done probably almost 24 interviews for this oral history of Napa Valley, and I had not seen any real carnage from the fire until I started driving up here.
The fire started about a half mile from here.
Take us through your thought process of that whole thing.
Well, I saw the fire about 10 o'clock at night and alerted my daughter, and she took my wife and our granddaughters and our dogs and got out of here. Fire started to burn over the hill just above us. Fire then started to come up the canyon just below us. And about that time, I left for about 3 hours, came back. The winery was on fire. I call that pretty close.
The winery that is right over here?
That we're sitting in right now.
You're not Superman, so
Well, it was, fortunately the fire was located just in the door frame and in the wooden frame of a door right below the stairs here. So it was small enough where it could be put out with an extinguisher, but all the windows on one side of the winery were broken. And so the, fire department said in about 20 more minutes it probably would have gone up. You got there just in time.
So you actually took out the initial flame. That was the key. I understand. So, I don't detect any. As far as, do you know people that were affected by it?
Well, houses burned out on both sides of us. My daughter's house is also on the property, and one of the firefighters that was helping save her house lives a quarter mile from us, and while he was saving her house, his house burned down. So there was a lot of damage in our area.
How far through the book is Storybook?
How far through the book?
The start was 76.
Right.
Okay, so now we're in 2018. You've won all the awards. The quantified stuff is there.
Right.
Where are you in the book?
Where am I in the book? I'm here until the last page. There, is no alternative. So I intend to be here, meet with my crew every morning at 7 a.m., continue to plan, change, grow, make things better every year.
Just on an aside, did you ever cross paths with any of the spiritual gurus from East India? Like, were you familiar with those movements, the TM movements, Maharaji and those cats?
Yes, but I didn't.
What was your experience like in Europe, in the like the not the man-made caves, but can you talk about the first time you were in a natural cave somewhere in Europe and how and the impact it had on you?
In natural caves in Europe, well, there are the salt mines in Salzburg. There are places like that. Is that what you have in mind?
Like a wine cellar almost. That was not constructed. It was just part of the earth.
Well, the wine cellars were constructed. If you go to Champagne or any place else where you have extensive cellars, they're all built, obviously. They're not just natural.
But I mean, European wines, they scoffed at American wines. I mean, clearly there was a natural component to the wine in Europe.
Well, sure, they scoffed until the Judgment of Paris.
Explain the because that was when everybody said it's going to go to Burgundy and Bordeaux. Is that when that? Can you explain that to the audience?
Judgment of Paris was back in '76, actually.
1976.
Right, and what it was is that a series of Bordeaux wines from California and a series of Chardonnays from California were in competition, well, not in competition, but in judgment with an equal number of French wines from leading producers.
Wow.
And the panel was entirely French, and it was put on by Stephen Spurrier, and it was to show or to indicate to the French that the Californians are making pretty good wine, but there was also an evaluation of the wines. And in that evaluation, the American wines came in first, and to the chagrin of the French, of course. And that kind of put the Napa Valley in particular, because they were all Napa Valley wines.
That is unbelievable. I mean, how have you, never gone with? Have you ever been part of a trend movement, or how have you been able to stave off that going pop, so to speak?
Well, the world of wine is a little bit different than many other areas in the sense that there's a tradition of quality in that world, and that's a tradition that carries on beyond a generation. It kind of passes from generation to generation. So you're not dealing with something that's a passing phase, not the latest new thing, if you want. It's something that's traditional, and it's something that's quality oriented. And if you're producing that kind of quality where people can realize it, and there are standards for it, then you have a continuous audience for it.
How many different types of wine, how many grapes do you grow here now? You said 5 were originally here now. Is it only Zin?
Right. We have the Bordeaux varieties, which are Cabernet, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Cabernet Franc. We have 4 of the 5. We have primarily Zinfandel. We're primarily a Zinfandel house. And we have a little bit of white wine, a little bit of Viognier.
Have you, do you what kind of, how often do you drink wine? Do you drink it with meals? And can you speak to the effort by the Renault Society? Professor Renault was the one who did this research about, the French. They smoke cigarettes. They don't work out a lot. They eat a lot of fatty food, and they never have heart attacks.
Sure, that's because they drink a lot of wine.
Exactly. Well, but talk about it in correlation. Have you been doing that with meals for how long? And is your heart health good?
Hey, I'm over 80. I'm up working these fields. I'm still a tractor driver.
Wow. That's right. I've called you a few times. You're mostly
good health, and we drink wine twice a day. With lunch and dinner.
So can you?
And on Sunday we have champagne with breakfast. So.
Can you talk about the kind of wine that you had with lunch today?
What we have with lunch today, we had one of our Zinfandels actually with lunch today, so that was quite.
Did you have 2 glasses or 1?
Just 1.
And what did you have to eat though?
I actually had a salmon sandwich, roast salmon from the night before. We had a large fish, so we had a little bit left over, which we had as a sandwich during the day.
What is one thing that you're, what do you continually learn? Everyone's continually learning. Specifically, what is one thing that you've learned recently that was humbling and inspiring to you?
The next vintage is my best vintage. By that I mean, whatever you've done in the past, no matter what accolade you've received, you can still do better, and others are competing to see if they can do better than you. So you've got to keep going every single year.
We'll have to leave it there. Jerry Seps, Storybook continues. The story lives on. Thank you, brother.